Okay, so Nora, if you may want to mute your sound, just in case you're unmuted. Okay. All right, so welcome everyone to the webinar, Tree Stewards, Case Study of a Virginia Urban Tree Volunteer Program. My name's Holly Campbell, and I will be the host for the webinar today. And, okay. I'm an Extension Associate with Southern Regional Extension Forestry, working in urban forestry and wildland fire education and outreach. So as part of the Cooperative Extension System, our office develops educational products and resources to support forestry and natural resource programs across the Southeastern U.S. region, like this webinar today. So our website is sref.info, which I have on the top right of the slide that you're seeing. So if you'd like to learn anything more about the office I work for, please go to that web link. Our presenter today is Nora Palmater from Trees, Virginia. Before formally introducing Ms. Palmater, I'll provide a short introduction. So first, I would like to thank the University of Georgia Cooperative Extension for co-hosting our Zoom webinar today. Today's webinar is part of a larger series entitled Understanding Urban and Community Forests, an Extension webinar series. The series was planned by Southern Regional Extension Forestry with input from several cooperative extension urban and community forestry experts in the Southern region. So this slide includes the planning partners for the series. Their input on key topics and speakers for the series was essential. So the series is designed for educators, specifically cooperative extension county educators. However, each webinar in the series may also be relevant to natural resource managers, other educators, arborists, urban foresters, and more. So regardless of your work focus, all are welcome to join today's webinar and any webinars in the series. The goal of the series, which includes 12 webinars in all, is two-part. So one, to increase extension educators' knowledge of research-based urban and community forestry information, and two, to provide educational resources that support delivery of that information to the public. So ultimately, the series aims to increase Extension's role in urban and community forestry education and outreach. We're really hoping the series will reach not only Extension personnel focused on horticulture, urban forestry, and natural resources, but also Extension involved in family and consumer science and other focus areas where appropriate. So this slide includes some of the other webinars in the series. I couldn't list all of them because there wasn't room, so you'll see that some dates are listed up above, and you can explore those more completely on the webinar portal. For those of you who are not familiar with the cooperative extension, the Smith-Lever Act formalized extension in 1914, establishing the U.S. Department of Agriculture's partnership with land-grant universities to apply research and provide non-formal agricultural education. So Congress created the extension system to address rural agricultural issues. Today, however, extension has expanded its focus to match changes in society and economics, providing research-based education in areas like family and consumer sciences, forestry and natural resources, youth education, and more. So popular extension programs include 4-H and the Master Gardener program. Extension is a trusted information resource in communities, and for those of you who are not part of Extension, hey, we make great partners to help disseminate information to the public. So keep us in mind as a potential partner on your next urban and community forestry project. So though several extension educators provide urban and community forestry information to their communities, the number of educators in this area are few. Our hope is that these webinars help increase extension educators' role in urban and community forestry education and outreach. There are likely some participants listening to this webinar who are unfamiliar with a few of the many benefits of urban trees and forests. Urban trees and forests help clean our water and air, reduce hot summer temperatures, wind speed, and noise. They've been shown to reduce crime and provide a sense of place and connection, beauty, and food. They also reduce our energy bills and increase our property value. And as Nora Palmater will share momentarily, urban trees continue to provide these benefits with public support and when they are properly cared for. So I would now like to introduce our speaker, Nora Palmater. Ms. Palmater is a retired volunteer manager and has been a Trees, Virginia tree steward since 2001, or for 17 years. So we welcome you, Nora. Are you ready to get started? I'm going to stop sharing my slides.
I am. Let's see now. I do share screen and put this up and put it on slideshow. Okay. From the beginning, all right, we got it. That's Perfect. The hardest part of the webinar. So I was delighted to talk about this topic because it combines two of my favorite things, volunteerism and trees. I started my volunteer career as a Brownie Scout. And like many of you, I've always been an active volunteer in a lot of different type programs. And then during the AIDS epidemic in the late 80s, I was working in public health and switched to being the volunteer director for the largest AIDS clinic in Washington. So for 8 years, I worked with very committed, caring people, and of 2,000 volunteers. And I learned the systems for volunteer management, as well as later teaching at the community college on how to do volunteer management for nonprofits. And then, as Holly said, in 2001, I took the Tree Steward training and have been active at that ever since. And that training was a good example of partnership because the training was held in an Arlington County, Virginia building with the support of the county urban forester and a grant from Trees, Virginia that started it, and the local extension agent. So it's always been a partnership in terms of tree stewards. Now, I have to warn you that I woke up this morning with a nasty throat. So if you hear me cough or start choking, don't worry. I've got lots of cough drops and hot water here.
Hopefully there won't be any choking.
Hopefully not, but we'll take care of it. Okay, the first thing to understand is that Tree Stewards is not a copyrighted name. That is, it's not like Girl Scouts of the United States, where a Girl Scout troop in every city belongs to the greater Girl Scouts of the United States. Tree Stewards is used by a lot of different groups. My parents were tree stewards in Indiana, and that was like 30 years ago. They always swear that theirs was the first tree stewards group started. I don't know about that, but it was through the State Department of Natural Resources. And then other states and localities have lots of similar volunteer groups. You know, they might be called Friends of Trees, Up with Trees. Here in DC, we've got Casey Trees, Tree People, and of course, there's always the Trees Fredericksburg, Trees Atlanta, Trees whatever. And what it shows is that the name doesn't really matter. What matters is the love of trees. So the oldest tree steward group in Virginia was started 26 years ago in Lynchburg. And the interesting thing about that is that it predates the Trees Virginia organization and the Extension Master Gardener Tree Stewards. And then, of course, we've now got 11 tree steward groups around the state. Each one is different. 3 of the groups require their members to be master gardeners. You go through the very intensive Master Gardener program. And then once a year or once every 2 or 3 years, there's a Tree Steward Advanced Training. One group of tree stewards in Roanoke are actually city volunteers. They fill out the forms to work with the city and they assist specifically the city horticulturalist in doing all of her projects. And then 7 of us are independent community groups. We might be 501c3s, we might be more informal or formal, but we're not connected with the city or with the extension program. And as you can see, in 2017, Trees Virginia had a lot of volunteer hours from the Tree Stewards and other groups. I should say this includes some planting programs that might have been held at colleges, board member volunteers, other things. And if you're wondering where that number, 1,500,000 comes from, on the last slide, it has the information for independentsector.org, which is the one that figures out what the dollar value of volunteerism is in the United States. I think it's around $24 right now. Now, I'm real sorry that my partner, John, couldn't be here today to talk more in depth about the Master Gardener program for the advanced training of tree stewards. But he's put the information out there, and you can go online and look at their manual, read information about it. And if there's something you'd like to use or talk with him about, I do encourage you to contact them. The Master Gardeners, tree stewards, tend to be more focused on education, demonstration projects. They also probably do more on the physical health of the trees, whereas I think a lot of Trees Virginia tree stewards focus more on the community, looking at the advocacy of trees. The interesting part here is that Trees Virginia is not in charge of tree steward groups. It's not like Extension, which has the set rules for master gardeners and tree stewards. Instead, each of us Trees Virginia group has set our own standards. They're all fairly similar, but they all have the ability to change the manual to make it so that what they do in their area reflects their needs. A good example of this is that in Arlington, one of our recent volunteer projects was to walk all up and down a very urban corridor where a lot of trees had been planted 10, 20 years ago with those hideous steel rings around them. And we were to check every tree for its growth into the ring collar. And then the staff set up times for their staff to come out and take care of the trees. Well, other places might not have that problem at all. In fact, Charlottesville, one of their big topics that they work on is they go out to the Monticello grounds, you know, Thomas Jefferson's home, and they've been clearing the trees of invasive ivy for a couple of years. Other places like Front Royal, which is very close to the Shenandoah National Forest, has a lot of its volunteer work and programs in the forested area. So their training is more interested also in the forest ecology, whereas up here in Northern Virginia, we get into a lot of training about street trees and silvacells and things like that that make a difference. all of the groups emphasize training. It's about 30 hours initially, and then we require every Tree Steward member to get 5 hours annually of continuing education. And this can vary a lot. We're pretty lenient on what can count as continuing education. A webinar like this could be going to a program done by the National Park Service, or the local urban forester could count. Trainings are done in a way that the local group decides. Quite a lot of us use the old standard of meeting once a week for 2 to 3 hours for 10 weeks, with maybe 3 Saturdays of tree walks, pruning practice, a planting event. Another way the Master Gardeners Tree Stewards do is that every 3 years or so, they have a statewide college at which they have an intensive 3-day program. And John has kindly given us the link to the June 2018 training that was done. So you can look at what exactly it was they covered. Now, up here in Northern Virginia, Alexandria and Arlington are going to test out a new model. We're going to have the participants in for 2 classes and a field day every month for an entire year. And that way we're going to be able to target our training on what the tree work is that you would do at that time of year. One of the frustrations of having everything all at once, of course, is that if you do it in the winter, you can do winter tree ID and pruning, but it's pretty hard to tell the trees for newbies. Whereas if you do it in the hot summer months, you can look at the leaves and do a lot of training about tree ID, but you really don't want to do training. So our concept is that once a month we'll do this. And one of the other reasons we're switching to it is that we're all volunteer. We don't have any paid staff. So you can get a tree steward, an experienced tree steward, someone who's been around for years, to say, well, I'll do the planting month in October. I'll plan the presentations and get a program for them. You know, and you can kind of divide it up a little easier because we all have volunteer commitments. And Master Gardeners have extension, which if there's any extension agents out there, I know you are terribly overworked, and how much support you can provide to each group is minimal. But there is a staff person with the Master Gardener Tree Stewards. Trees Virginia Tree Steward groups have no paid staff. We are all volunteer. One of the things we can do as nonprofits is we can solicit grant money. And from Trees Virginia, we can get up to $500 every 2 or 3 years, depending on budget restrictions. And the great thing about that, as you can see on the slide, is that it's flexible. You know, we could use it to purchase a table and chairs to do farmers market exhibits, or we can use it to purchase shovels and clippers for the hands-on. I think we tree stewards used it for Arlington and Alexandria, used it to purchase those cool yellow vests that our volunteer over to the right is wearing. The other thing we've done is several of us who are 501c3s have gotten funding from Arbor Day Foundation and from TD Bank for plantings in the fall. TD Bank has been very supportive in Alexandria. They not only give you money for purchasing the trees that are going to be planted and for supplies you might need, but they furnish all of their staff for a day of the corporate volunteering. And then the staff do the actual work, and we tree stewards are to work with them on teams and make sure that, you know, the way you properly plant a tree with the size of the hole, the not planting it too deep or too high, and the appropriate mulch is done. And best of all about TD Bank is that they gave us enough money to hire a contractor to water these trees for 2 years. And that's, well, you all know how important it is to water young trees. So I just love that bank. The good thing about volunteers is that we can do what urban forestry staff can't. We can go onto the private property, we can get involved with our own churches, our own homeowners associations. We try to recruit people from the HOAs, the condos, the churches, because up here in our urban area, that's where the green space still remains. That's where we've got mature trees. So we target those groups trying to get a tree steward trained who will work on that greens committee. And of course, we can advocate with our representatives, which staff can't. Additionally, we often have professional skills from our other life, separate from the forestry. So things like being able to set up a website can be done more simply by us. However, with all of this, volunteers will never replace staff. We're not ISA certified arborists. We lack the skills. And if we think a task is boring or not needed or too difficult, we simply don't volunteer. So that's when staff has to do it. I've been in a lot of budget discussions, and I just cringe when I hear someone say, well, we can cut that position and have volunteers do it. And it makes me want to stand up and scream and say, no, volunteers can't replace staff. Someone still has to organize them. We can certainly jump in and help when there's a budget crisis, but we don't replace staff. Probably the biggest thing that all tree steward groups do is community education. And I think volunteers in general are accepted so much more by the community, because if you're a volunteer, it's like you're knowledgeable already. You're giving of your time, and people like to hear what you have to say. The Front Royal Tree Stewards had a booth at a recent, I think it was an Earth Day event, where they had children's activities, and they really got a lot of people coming to it. I mean, I would have liked to have seen it, because they told me that they had both types of tree cookies that you could eat and take home. The tree distributions, tree giveaways are popular in a lot of jurisdictions. And what we tree stewards can do is make sure the education gets to the homeowner, not simply handing them a pamphlet, but talking with them. Excuse me a minute. So we go to all of these events. We also have websites and Facebook pages. And we can go onto homeowners' property, I mean, with their invitation, if they invite us to. We'll advertise that if they want us to come out, actually look at the property and help them decide where that red oak should be planted, we can help them figure out, well, there's a utility line, there's a utility underground, you're too close to the house, where do you go? And this fall, we're going to have in Arlington Tree Canopy Fund has arranged for 330 trees to go on private property. And among all of those, tree stewards help do the site visits, going out and talking with people about where they would best be going. Now, I have to say, we're not professional arborists. We keep our advice at the health education level, I would say. We share information. We can point out to people where to find information online. And of course, if someone asks us, is that tree hazardous? We all know to say, I can't tell you that, but let me work with you on how to hire a certified arborist and help them figure out the best way to get a knowledgeable person. Here's one of our current campaigns. Mature trees are valuable trees. And this can be accessed and downloaded from the webinar link. And it's public domain. You can look at it. If it suits your needs, then take it. Arlington Tree Stewards developed it through money that we got from the Tree Canopy Fund because we're a 501c3. And with that money, we hired a communications expert to really do focus groups and surveys about what do people like about mature trees and what would encourage them to keep more mature trees. So it was developed with that in mind because up here in our urban area, we have so much infill development and big houses replacing little ones with no room for trees. So if it fits your group, then please use it.
Hi, Nora. Can I interrupt you just one second? I just wanted to reiterate something Nora just said, where all of you joined this webinar from on the webinar portal. I have uploaded the document that Nora just showed us on mature trees, so you can access the PDF there and download it. That's it. Sorry, I just wanted to reiterate that.
That's great. No, do it because we created it specifically for our little urban area. But if it fits the needs of people in Chicago or anywhere else, go for it. So the other thing we tree stewards do is we do direct tree care. This is probably the most popular for tree stewards. A lot of us had jobs as careers where we stayed behind desks and worked on computers a lot. And now that we don't have to be there anymore, we like to be outside. And well, let me just give you some examples of what we do. In Roanoke, of course, they work directly with the city horticulturalist who may have them potting up young trees, may have them pruning street trees. She sort of decides what needs to be done. In Richmond, the tree stewards have zeroed in on a couple of avenues right there in Richmond that the arborist has asked them to keep keep in shape. So they work on that. In Arlington, we meet quarterly with our urban forester, who at that time will give us a list of parks or street trees that he thinks could benefit from our help. We also have, because we're up here right by so many national parks, the National Park Service nursery is near us, and quite a few of our volunteers work on the elm trees that are going down to the National Mall. Now, when I say we prune the trees and all, the rules, of course, are that we stay on the ground. We can use pruners. What else? We don't work on certain streets. The streets that they've asked us to prune trees on are those where it's not a safety hazard. If it's a safety issue on a very busy street, then that would still be staff with, the lanes cut off, shut off, and the police needing to do it. But by specializing on the younger trees that have just been planted in the last couple of years, it helps because that avoids problems with trees once they get too large. If we can create central leaders at every place and handle any girdling roots that we can, whenever it's a young tree, then that certainly helps to create them higher. Let's see. And, I can't say it more, but volunteers love these type of tasks. If you're going to be thinking about getting a volunteer group going, do keep it on outdoor work outside at first, because that's what they love. Another thing we do outside is, because we're skilled, and that's a very important point, is that we've had the training. We can go through and check street trees that were planted a year, 2 years ago, and report back on any problems we see, so that the county forester can then go out and see it. One of the tasks we really loved was on the right. You see the two people were tagging trees. We went out to a native tree nursery, and we were the ones who got to decide what 300 trees would be purchased for the tree canopy fund. And in this way, again, we're able to use our knowledge and make sure that we only got trees with a central leader, we got trees with no girdling roots. It's that whole idea of making sure that care is done when it's a young tree. So how do we do this? I've thought this for 17 years. How do we tree stewards coordinate ourselves? And I think it's organized anarchy or anarchical organization. It's a mystery to me how we can do so much. We sometimes do it on consensus basis. You can get one person to volunteer for a small task regularly, like plan the November program or schedule tree tables, whereas it's really hard to get someone to take over a task for an entire year. Let me say a word about risk assessment. Non-tree risk assessment. We don't do risk assessment of trees, but I come from the healthcare background, and I find it fascinating that so many organizations have a fear of volunteers being used. They'll say things like, well, we could get sued. We have to be careful with that. And, in clinics and hospitals, we couldn't survive without our volunteers. And we tend to look at it as, Are you a volunteer or paid staff isn't important. What's important is what's your certification level? What have you been trained at? What is your experience and your skills? I really hate it when I hear one of our staff people say, well, we don't let volunteers spray the pesticide. Only staff can do that. And it would be much better if they would have it that any pesticide user must have current state licensing, have attended 2-hour safety course, wear protective clothing, whatever the criteria is. Because if you try to do it on, are you paid or non-paid staff? What do you do when someone who's a retired arborist comes in and wants to volunteer with you? So what really works for risk assessment is to think about what could go wrong and then set the guidelines and the rules to address each of those. One other topic that is really hot news, of course, is children. And we Tree Stewards have a written policy that we are not a child-serving organization. Any minor or youth that comes to a volunteer event has to be with a parent or guardian. We don't serve children. Now, we have done a lot of volunteer going out to educate scout troops, or I'll take a brownie troop through a tree walk in a park. But the leader is in charge. We Tree Stewards are not, and we never, our written policy is that a tree steward is never alone without the guardian. The reality is, I mean, I did this for years as the volunteer director, is that most states have very good volunteer protection laws, and that risk assessment, thinking what could go wrong, and then setting the policy and training is the answer. Now, the reality is that every volunteer event is going to have a waiver. It just seems to be the way we are, but it doesn't replace that need to really think about what could go wrong and how do I avoid it. I was asked to give our accomplishments. And Arlington, Alexandria does an incredible amount. And large towns, urban areas, are going to have an easier time recruiting volunteers and using them than if you're in a rural or a very small town. Just because the numbers of people that you have to pull in from is going to be less. Lynchburg, which has been around for 26 years, only has about 14 tree stewards. So the hours that they do will be much less, but they're really seen as an important part of the Lynchburg urban forestry. So, lessons learned about volunteering. First, of course, relationships matter more than anything. Face-to-face always does it better than sending emails. Email is quick and easy, but email is best used for sharing information and not for recruitment. So you've listened to all of this and you've thought, all right, I want volunteers. I want that many hours contributed in my community. And I say, great, go for it. There's people wanting to volunteer everywhere. Just that you have to be clear about what's the purpose for why you want volunteers. And that's the whole thing about, do you want to plant the trees or do you want to do the education? Whenever I trained volunteers for our AIDS program, we would do trainings of 100 people a weekend. And they go through the 10-hour training after they'd been screened. But less than half of them would ever become volunteers after the training. They just sort of drifted away. I mean, you could call them, but they didn't respond. And then after a year, only a fifth of those were still active volunteering. So staff and I really were bummed out by this until we realized that, you know what? We trained 100 people in this very serious topic. So that was a success. And I submit that you have to think about what's the purpose for why you want volunteers. And, you know, 5 of us who went through the Tree Steward training in 2001 out of 25 or 30 people are still active. So the amount of time we've put in for that little bit of training and support is really pretty good. Here's the volunteer management cycle that many of you have seen. The most important part, I think, is the planning and the maintaining of the volunteers. We tend to focus on the recruiting and training part, like how do I get volunteers and how do I train them? But it's a lot easier to maintain tree stewards that have 17 years of experience than to train a whole bunch of new ones. So focus on the maintaining and the planning. I would suggest, I think in terms of what's the end result that you want. What's the success you want? It may be that success in a very rural area is cultivating 2 or 3 people to work as volunteers alongside of you. It may be in an urban area that you want to train 100 people every 2 weeks. So it's looking at what's the success for you. And then, of course, you base the recruiting on your plan. Whether it's if you're going to use volunteers in daytime work weeks, then have the training in the weekday. If you're going to use college students, well, college students are great. They tend to only be able to stay for 6 months to a year. And you have to ask yourself, am I spending this time trying to get volunteer work done, or am I spending the time to create knowledge in the younger generation? Training, I already talked about. The Tree Steward models are up. I will say that Casey Trees in DC, the model they use is to recruit large groups to do the in-depth tree planting after a 10-minute demonstration with experienced tree volunteers. And then they offer all these classes for people to sign up for. The other thing about Casey Trees is that they are incredibly good about sharing information. So I urge you to look at their website and all the material up there because they're just great about that. Supervising, it's the same way you would staff. I will say that in my experience, It's less stressful with volunteers than paid staff. And you use the same supervision techniques that you would with your paid staff. And maintaining is the key. One of our more fun volunteer things that we did is at Halloween, we tree stewards had a tree walk in a cemetery where we'd been volunteering. And that's really cool. You know, we then stood around and toasted ourselves. So, two options for getting a volunteer group going. One is to collaborate. Is there a group already out there that you could sort of piggyback on? You can offer all sorts of things. I mean, you've got the experience, the expertise. You could do field trips. You can do the education for people. And you can work on pulling in college students or master gardeners and get the thing going. So that's one way to do it, which is less time consuming, but you've got less control. Option two is creating your own volunteer program. And if you're thinking of doing that, I suggest that you contact 2 or 3 other tree lovers and have brunch together and talk with them about how they could help you do it, whether they think it's a good idea, whether it would be necessary. And Arlington Tree Stewards, we've been around 17 years, but for the first 8 years, we did not have elected officers. We didn't have bylaws. We were just this sort of loose group of people that like trees. And every so often someone would say, let's get together and do this, or talk with an urban forester and find a planting task for us to do. We tended to work more among churches, on school grounds, etc. But then after 8 years, we got organized. We became a 501c3, wrote bylaws, began getting money, have officers. So don't be surprised if it takes a long time for an all-volunteer group to get organized. In conclusion, volunteers are not free, no matter what someone tells you. It costs money to keep them organized and going. And only you can assess whether this is a good use of your time. If you take on the work of coordinating volunteers, creating a program, what part of your work might you have to give up? Because if you're a manager, you have to think about that. But volunteers are very worth the effort. You'll notice that that time that Arlington Alexandria Tree Stewards put in, that is the equivalent of 2 full-time employees. So here's the resources. And do I turn this back over to you, Holly?
Yeah, I can actually
stop share?
Yeah, stop sharing.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Nora. That was fabulous. That was a lot of information towards personally something that I'm interested in for Georgia. So I learned a lot, and as I'm sure everyone on the call did. So everyone, this is sort of the Q&A time. If you have a question for the speaker, please don't type it in the chat box. Type it in what's called the Q&A box, because I may overlook the chat box comments. But as people are typing questions right now, I'm going to go over this last slide where where you can gather a little bit of information here. And also, Nora, if you are able to copy and paste those links on your last slide and put them in the chat box, that might be helpful for everyone. Or if not, I can just email them out to all the participants. Okay, so again, for those who joined after we got started, our speaker was Norma, and I'm probably going to mispronounce your last name. Why don't you just say it for me, Nora?
Nora Palmatier.
Palmatier. I kept wanting to say palm, like the wonderful tree-like.
Right.
Yeah. Anyway, so her email address is here if you have any questions for her. Also, originally this webinar, as Nora mentioned earlier on, had a second speaker, but his name was John Freeborn, and he was of Virginia Tech. He's an assistant master gardener coordinator for Virginia, so he was going to talk about the master gardener side of Tree Stewards, but he was unable to present today. So Nora fortunately stepped up and was able to provide a full presentation for us, and I really appreciate that. So John has provided this web link to us that's on this page here. So you guys can, actually I'll stick that in the chat box as we're starting to do Q&As. And John's email address is on here as well. So you guys can reach out to him. As mentioned earlier when we got started, today's webinar is going to be archived, which on the webinar portal is called On Demand. So I'll have that up by Monday if you want to watch it again or refer it on to someone else. As mentioned, this webinar today is part of a series, and there's 12 webinars in the series. Today was number 10. Our next webinar is called What's Bugging Your Trees, Insect and Fungal Pests in Southeastern Landscapes. So this is a sort of a Southeastern specific sort of urban tree health webinar, though all are welcome. It's taught by Dr. David Coyle of Clemson University, and that's going to be on September 26th. So if you have any information about the series, you can reach out to me. My email address is here. If you are interested in figuring out how you're going to get ISA credits for today's webinar, if you go back to your open browser window, you can continue the step 2 process for completing the short quiz and then getting your certificate so you can get your credits. Okay, so let's see what some of the questions that we've gotten. Okay.
I see that a couple on grants, which I can easily take.
Okay, so I'll read the question out, and then that way everyone will know what we're talking about. So we had one participant say, can volunteer hours of Tree Stewards count towards grant matching funds in urban and community forestry grant projects?
Absolutely. Our Department of Forestry contact in Trees, Virginia uses them every year. And the Arlington Urban Forester uses them for the Tree City application too.
Okay, and so just sort of following up with that, someone else said with grants, how do you manage the funds, expenditures, and reporting? And I guess that's with the understanding that your group doesn't have any paid staff.
Right. 2 ways. Richmond Tree Stewards actually got their local community foundation to be the recipient financial manager. So they went through them and they handled that aspect of it. For our group, we're not talking federal grants here. These are really easy. The ones from Arbor Day and TD Bank were so simple. You just filled them out online. And we do have to, our Tree Steward board, before we will accept any money for doing a project, has to have someone, a volunteer, who has agreed to make sure that everything gets done. But we've never applied for a grant that requires a lot of work, and I wouldn't want to. The ones from Arbor Day Foundation are very simple and online.
Okay. I just answered one question by text, which was regarding another webinar in the series, but let's see. Forgive me if I missed it, but do you have a minimum volunteer hour requirement for your tree stewards beyond the training hours requirement?
Yes, we do. Each tree steward group has that on paper. The reality is that we'd have to get a volunteer to sit down and check it every year to make sure that everyone got their, I forget even what we have, 8 hours of volunteering after the first year and 5 hours of continuing education. But no one's ever volunteered to track that the way master gardeners do. So it's out there, and we ask it. The reality, in my opinion, is that most tree stewards put in a lot more hours than they ever get around to recording.
Okay. I think you answered this one, but maybe just reiterate. So do tree stewards have volunteers sign release of liability between them and cities or counties where they do tree pruning or planting projects?
You know, it varies a great deal depending upon the jurisdiction. Most of the events that we work with fall under the one-time large events that either Arlington County or Alexandria City are holding. And they always have these sign-in forms that you sign and say you will get rid of your firstborn if something happens bad.
Okay, probably have time for just a couple more questions. So I apologize if I don't get to all of them. What are the usual sources of grants that tree stewards apply for? How do tree stewards deal with any constraints common in some grants concerning purchasing equipment, building capacity?
Well, we do not do a lot of grant writing. That's not it. The biggest way that we get money is from our members. We have a $20 a year membership fee, and some of our members give more than that to us. I can tell you that nationally, 85% of all charity comes from individual donors. So the only tree grant place has been Arbor Day Foundation. And of course, here in Arlington, we have the County Tree Canopy Fund, which is only for Arlington.
Okay. So there's one question here. Someone has entered it twice, but I'm not sure if you'll be able to answer it, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Is there a training curriculum out there for young tree structural pruning? I need to hold a training and I'm hoping not to recreate the wheel.
Go to kctrees.org and do a search for young tree pruning. They have videos that are really great. They've got 4 sets that we use.
Great, thank you. Okay, let's just do one more here. Okay, our municipality has a shade tree commission. Can tree steward volunteers work with the appointed township commissions, or do they need to be separate?
I would answer that as both. We have an urban forestry commission, which is advisory to the county board. And 3 tree stewards serve on it, happen to be serving on it, but they don't serve as tree stewards. I mean, we may report our hours for it, but it's not a tree steward function. You get on a shade tree commission or an urban forestry commission because you're a resident, and usually there's, you know, it's just being clear who you owe the loyalty to.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, this is, we've probably met all that we have time for today. I was just typing a response to someone else who said, how do I get back to the post survey? That was something I just mentioned earlier. If you are interested in doing the post survey or obtaining your ISA CEUs, you need to go back to your open browser window with the webinar portal. So when you, before you logged on, you would have been in the webinar portal. And then when you click the join, it will open up a new browser window. So you need to go back to the original browser window to complete step 2 to do the post survey. So I just wanted to mention that. I won't answer it over text. But again, I wanted to say thank you so much to our wonderful speaker. And I didn't know if you had anything else you wanted to share before we closed out.
No, just volunteers are great. They're, you know, I encourage everyone to get out and volunteer. Oh, and I will tell you, Holly, that whenever we were doing our Tree Steward manual for the state, we used the Georgia Tree Stewards manual. So
great.
they existed 10 years ago.
We'll have to look into that. Okay, great. Well, thanks everyone for joining the webinar. Again, it's going to be archived if you'd like to watch it again, and I should have that up by this coming Monday. So thanks again, and everyone have a great day.
Okay.